First of all, thank you very much for your presence. Because, before giving the floor to Hilde Voutmans, I want to say welcome naturally to the Minister of Defense of Czechia, Mr. Stropnický. Thank you very much, Mr. Stropnický, to be here. I want also to say welcome to Annemie, our former colleague who is here, and especially also to those who I don't know what they like more, but who went back to their country. Mr. Ahlund from Finland, welcome back to the group. Mr. Ahlund, Karol, the former Minister of Defense of Finland, and also to Janine, welcome back. And maybe you don't return to Den Haag anymore, okay? So thank you very much, the Minister of Defense of the Netherlands. So Hilde, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much, Guy, and thank you for this brief introduction. Let me welcome you all here today, and especially also to the coordinator of the AFET committee, Hans, who is sitting with us. And of course, Guy said it already, a warm welcome to the 3 Liberal Ministers of Defense who have joined us this morning. I don't have to tell you that our European project is facing security threats at its borders, at the east and at the south. These threats, colleagues, no European member state can face them alone. And the European Council is only putting little steps forward, contrary to the pace of evolution surrounding us. Let us be honest. Europe, 28 member states, each of them with their own military forces, one stronger than the other. But if something really happens on our territory, or if we are really threatened, we have to rely on the US and NATO to protect us. And it's not a secret if I tell you that the American political leaders are asking us to take more responsibility to protect our territory, to create a real European pillar within NATO, to strengthen NATO. The European foreign affairs policy does not have enough force to make the difference in the world. Let us face it. We don't have a European defense to back up our foreign affairs policy. Our defense and security policy is based on a note of Solana of 10 years ago. We need integrated military forces as soon as possible. Not only for budgetary reasons we have to fight for this. Everybody knows that defense budgets are often the first one to be cut, as at the national level, military systems are seen as costly and as the easy way to reduce expenses. It is time to face it. National armies have been hollowed out to a shadow of their former selves. And at the same time, I can assure you that if there is something that the European citizens ask us, political leaders of Europe, to do, that is to work together to create a European defense union, a European army. Of course to save money, but also to protect our European values. And that is what we, the ALDE group in the European Parliament, want to present today, on the eve of the European Summit. A way to achieve this, a liberal view on the future of European defense, a way to have more defense for less money. So with this brief introduction, I would like to give the floor to Guy Verhofstadt, former Prime Minister of Belgium. Everybody knows that, of course. And since 2009, he is a member of the European Parliament, and he is our leader of the ALDE group. And he will present the position paper of the group. Guy.
Thank you. Let me say that I'm going to do that in a very short way. I think it's also important that we discuss a little bit the political environment in which this point have been put on the agenda and the way it's going to be treated tomorrow or after tomorrow on the agenda, if it is still on the agenda. I'm not so sure about it. Because originally the European Council of tomorrow was set to discuss progress in European security and defense policy, an exercise that normally the Council is doing every 18 months. And the idea was to take stock of the situation and to encourage further cooperation. But as I understand, there will not be much time to deal with the topic tomorrow. Apparently, there are other issues, as we all know, and we will see very short conclusions, and my fear is a postponement of the debate to a later date. And if you look to the challenges around Europe, and also at the state of our public budgets right now, we feel that it is a very bad idea to postpone these strategic discussions. And we keep continuing to push for an in-depth decision and step forwards in the European Council in the coming months. And maybe the fact that we have the Luxembourg presidency in the next 6 months and then the Dutch presidency in the beginning of 2016 can be of some help to go forward with this agenda. We have discussed in the ALDE group the question of defense policy in detail, and we have prepared a paper that have sent it to everybody of you to establish a European Defense Union with a roadmap towards integrated military forces by 2025. 2025, that's yeah, more or less 72 years after the previous attempt to make a European defense community in 1953, when in 1953-54, when the French National Assembly voted down that proposal. It was not only a proposal about the defense community, it was also a proposal to build up a political union together with this defense union. And because the defense union was voted down in the French Assembly, the founding fathers didn't go forward with the other piece, the political union, in 1953-54. So that means that defense is important, because at that moment defense was so important that because there was no defense community, it was not necessary to continue to talk about the political union in the 50s. Now we do it the other way around. I think what we have put forward to you is essentially a European defense capability that should become an integrated pillar of NATO and should do two things. That is to strengthen the defense of the territory of the European Union in complementarity to NATO, and also to have the possibility to Europe to act autonomously in operations abroad. The roadmap that we have presented takes, in fact, inspiration from the Delors report in 1988, what was the launching pad for the internal market, the euro, and so on. We have in our paper 4 pillars. I'm going to be very short about this. First of all, we ask that we finally, after 12 years, we should have a new strategic foreign and security strategy in the European Union, because the Solana paper is still the basis of our strategic thinking, but it dates from 2003. So the world has changed a lot between 2003 and today. So first things first, we need a new foreign and security strategy paper. And what our proposal is that by the end 2015 or in the course of 2016, that should be ready. The second is that a further progressive integration of certain elements of national military forces as the basis of the Eurocorps is our second proposal. Because if you make the list of all military cooperation inside the Union, it's quite inflationary. You have the Nordic cooperation, you have the Visegrad cooperation, you have the Baltic cooperation, you have the best of all, the Benelux cooperation, Janine. You have the Italian-Spanish, the Italian-French cooperation, you have the Dutch-German cooperation, and you have Eurocorps with the integrated French-German brigade. And the idea we have is to say, okay, let's work on, let's put all this progressively together, and if we do that, we can have, based on that, more integrated European forces, and not only on land, because yeah, Eurocorp is land, but also in the air and on sea. And secondly, let's now also have a permanent EU operational headquarters instead of the stupid situation today that every time when there is an operation outside the European Union, we have to decide what headquarter is taking the lead. And there are 3 headquarters always taking the lead. By accident is or Germany, or France, or London. And I tell you that story because that was the basis of an old story that I lived personally. That was the chocolate summit, where we tried to change that. And to say, yeah, Italy is also preparing a headquarter. And at that time, even Greece was preparing a headquarter. I don't know if it has been established, yes or no. Maybe they have in the meanwhile. Thank you, Karel. They have in the meanwhile. So it's a country nearly bankrupt, but they have the luxury to have a headquarter. And Spain was also working on that. So the idea was at that moment, yeah, instead of having 6 headquarters and then having a fight every time who is taking the lead of an operation, why should it not be better to have a European capability? What a mess, this discussion. I got already a facility near Tervuren. The French and so it was Jacques Chirac and Schröder backed the idea. Then Tony Blair was fully against it, and the outcome was, okay, we shall create not a headquarter, but a planification cell, what exists today, but not in Tervuren, because you asked Tervuren, so it's not in Tervuren, it's going to be in the Kortenberglaan. What is the case? In the Kortenberglaan in Brussels. It's, we can visit it together this afternoon if you want, because it's at 200 meters, 300 meters from here. Has it been used? Never. Why not? Because there is a veto right on the use of the European headquarters. So if one country is saying, no, no way, then automatically it cannot be used, this planification cell, and we fall back or on one of the big headquarters that exist in the European Union. And mainly, let's be honest, the most of the operations that we have outside the European Union are led by one country using their headquarters, and then we add a little bit of elements of other countries around it to give the impression that it is a European thing that we are developing. That's the way it works. And what country is doing the job? Well, that depends on the colonial past of that country. Then, so in Mali, it are the French going in, and when it is another country, then we see what link there is with member states of the European Union. Then 3, we want, the 3rd pillar of our proposal is having an integrated defense market and European capabilities. And the 4th is to have an upgrading decision-making framework, and later on also budgetary means to make all this possible. So that is what we have proposed. It's not a roadmap for a few months. A forward-looking proposal, what is absolutely necessary from time to time to do so in politics, certainly in European politics. And I'm very pleased that these 3 ministers of defense can join us to tell us also what they think. That could be the steps in the future that are feasible, that are realistic, and that are going in the right direction to reach our goal of a more integrated defense union in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So thank you very much, Guy, for this presentation. And then I think we have 3 guests who would like to come to us on different notes. And first, let me introduce you to Martin Srobnicki. He worked at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He was a Czech ambassador in Portugal, Italy, and the Holy See. In 1998, he was the Minister of Culture, and from 2003 to 2012, he was Artistic Director of the Vinohrady Theatre, and since 2013, he is Deputy in the Czech Parliament. He is now the Czech Minister of Defense, and I would like to give him the floor with a speech on European defense as a pillar of NATO. So please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Definitely, I'm a strange person. You know it now. Thank you, Guy, for the...
culture to defense, but why?
In changing my job every 10 years, I have to stop it. By the way, I will have to because of age. No, but seriously, I thank you for the invitation. It's the first time I'm in the club, and it's a very nice atmosphere here, nice people, and I'm looking forward to our further cooperation. The item is huge and quite complex. I basically like to be very brief. I'm afraid it will not be possible today. Already the slogan is excellent, more defense for less money, and I have said just in the corridor that some politicians in Europe and even some people and voters in Europe would change it maybe to more defense for no money at all. But definitely it's not possible. This kind of way of thinking is definitely not a good one. Maybe I will not defer that much of the paper, the excellent and inspiring paper you have presented and that I have read one week ago. But that's maybe a good sign that we go in a kind of similar direction. Europe has never been so prosperous, so secure, nor so free. The violence of the first half of the 20th century has given way to a period of peace and stability unprecedented in European history. No, I'm not joking. I just quoted the opening paragraph of the European Security Strategy that is still in force. And that's something you have mentioned. And that should provide the EU with key principles and guidelines for developing its defense and security capabilities. It's clear that this document, adopted back in 2003, is no longer able to meet its purpose, and that we now live in a very, very different times. The fact that we haven't been able to keep the European Union's basic strategic document up to date speaks volumes about our political will and a readiness to tackle security threats head-on. Any debate on improving our collective defense and security capacities, let alone on establishing a common European army, must start with frank examination of how we both nationally and as the Union react to unfavorable reality, whether we are ready to lead the way and make unpopular but necessary decisions, or whether we postpone crucial steps indefinitely and hope that problems will sort out themselves. The current immigration crisis is a good case study, and I will come back to it later. Longing for a unified European defense capacity, or the, in quotation marks, European army, has been around almost since the very beginning of European integration. The recent revival of the idea by President Juncker is mostly based on recycling the language that had been used many times before. The key difference now, compared to the past, is the strategic context in which the debate unfolds. We are indeed in the most complicated security situation in decades. We face a confusing array of traditional and new, conventional and unconventional threats. They are closely interlinked to create a ring of fire surrounding Europe in the east, southeast and south. What was new in President Juncker's March statement was that he explicitly linked the idea of developing an integrated European army with the need to deter Russia. This is a positive shift because it connects the debate on a more autonomous European defense with existing threats rather than with abstract aspirations to Europe's global greatness, as was usually the case in the past. Our debate can thus be much more rational than previously. If you remember the 1990s, discussions on developing European defense capacities were heavily loaded with anti-American sentiments. The main motivation was establishing the European Union as a global military player, which would be able to balance the power of the United States. Fortunately, this is long behind us, and almost nobody in Europe suffers from such dangerous illusions today. When President Juncker and others speak about the need to establish a common European military or to create a European defense union, their motivations are much more practical. One such motivation is trying to spend our limited resources more efficiently by eliminating redundancies stemming from the fact that our countries maintain separate militaries. Another motivation is that we should assume greater responsibility for our own defense and security, as the United States is busier with confronting security challenges elsewhere around the globe. These motivations are legitimate, but frankly, they are not new. They have formed the cornerstone of practical multinational defense cooperation in both the EU and NATO for the past 15 years. This means that, on the one hand, there has been a real progress since the 1990s in the sense that we no longer taint our debate on Europe's common defense by anti-American sentiments. On the other hand, we haven't progressed much on the crucial question of whether our defense should be based on intergovernmental or supranational solutions. That is the core of the debate today. To put the dilemma bluntly, should we more efficiently pool and share our national defense assets in order to save money and increase our collective capacities while these assets would stay under full control of national governments? Or should we create supranational defense assets owned and financed by the European Union and controlled by EU supranational bodies? Or is there a compromise possible, combining both approaches? I believe that our attempts at answering these questions should be firmly rooted in reality and in what is practically possible. We should refrain from framing the debate into excessively abstract thinking based on what we would do if the world was perfect. It is desirable and also practically achievable to support closer cooperation and coordination among our countries in the area of defense and security, with the aim to spend our limited defense budgets more efficiently, to boost our collective defense capacities, to increase interoperability, and to reduce unnecessary duplications. I hope that this gradual process, which has been underway for many years now, will eventually lead to the creation of a supranational European army. At the same time, it is clear that the bulk of military assets in Europe will remain under national control for many, many years to come. However, we don't need to just wait passively. We should start integrating, step by step, at least some specific defense capabilities to make them common EU assets, such as CBRN, cyber, surveillance, and airlift. We should patiently keep doing our homework, by which I mean implementing all those initiatives, projects, and activities aimed at bringing us closer together in defense. Attempts at circumventing this gradual and often unsuccessful effort smack of utopia and may end up in disaster. There are many activities going on that are vital for deepening our cooperation before we can realistically think of creating truly supranational assets. Nations develop joint rapid reaction forces in both the EU and NATO. There are several regional groupings, as has been mentioned, Benelux, Visegrad, Nordefco, engaged in cooperations across the entire spectrum of defense agenda, including formation of joint multinational units. There are multinational programs to share expensive defense assets such as airlift. Across Europe, key defense capabilities are being developed and used jointly, particularly when it comes to navies and air defenses. We train and exercise together, thus increasing interoperability between our armed forces. The European Defence Agency coordinates developing key strategic enablers Europe lacks: drones, air-to-air refueling, cyber, satellites. We affiliate our units to multinational corps headquarters, such as those in Szczecin and Münster. There are initiatives such as smart defense, pooling and sharing, and the framework nations concept. We exchange information on our national defense planning on a regular basis in order to identify opportunities for joint procurement. Our defense industries are closely interlinked across national borders. No, I'm not painting a rosy picture of the less than satisfactory reality. I know that many of these initiatives are more about talking than about doing. Many of them are lagging behind expectations. Some of them are quite openly failing. But my point is that the solution is not about simply discarding them and rushing to create a supranational European army, for which there is a clear lack of political will and popular support. In this and many other issues, there is another lack, a general lack of leadership in the EU. Another good example is the current immigration crisis. The EU's reaction to it has almost narrowed to the debate about introducing mandatory national quotas for accepting asylum seekers. But this is only a part, and let me say a smaller part of the problem. We spend a huge amount of our time and energy discussing a few dozen thousand asylum seekers when Europe faces millions of immigrants from areas affected by violence and poverty. According to estimations, there are at least 25 million people trying to get to Europe. In Africa alone, there are 650 million people living for less than $2 per day. The absorption capacity of Europe is a fraction of these numbers. We are facing a full-fledged crisis, but instead of bold and comprehensive response, we are preoccupied with small details and, at best, partial solutions. And here I would like to rebuff a cliché that immigration concerns the Southern and Western Europe members of the EU only, and that the Central European countries are unwilling to contribute to sharing this burden. It is simply not true. Currently, there are almost 500,000 of foreigners legally living in the Czech Republic, and at least several 100,000 illegal immigrants on top of that. Taken together, immigrants represent between 5 and 7% of our population. That's certainly not negligible. Over the past 2 decades, we have accepted and, by and large, integrated more than 100,000 Ukrainians, almost 100,000 Slovaks, and roughly 60,000 Vietnamese. Since the conflict erupted in eastern Ukraine early last year, several dozen thousands of Ukrainians, both legally and illegally, immigrated to the Czech Republic. We do share the burden. Going back to our common defense, we must do much more to promote the gradual merging of our defense policies and assets. Bringing the EU and NATO closer together should be a priority. EU battle groups on the one hand and the reformed NATO response force on the other hand should be better harmonized, including their certification requirements. In the European Union alone, we have plenty of opportunities for what to do. We should increase common financing of at least some elements of the CSDP, such as building and certifying the battle groups. We should adopt financial incentives to promote research and development in defense technologies. EDA's flagship projects in joint capabilities development are far from being completed. And let me add that we don't even have a dedicated Defense Affairs Council, where EU defense ministers would meet autonomously of the Foreign Affairs colleague and would adopt their own conclusions. It should be established as soon as possible to give more visibility to the defense agenda in the EU. I think that the situation is appropriate to that. Last but not least, we may and we should indeed think about establishing supranational defense assets owned by the European Union. Let's start with specific areas such as cyber and CBRN protection. In such a gradual way, we may, after some time, and don't ask me what time, arrive to the European army. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for this realistic and ambitious view. I think everybody will remember the lack of leadership of Europe and the question Thus, we have to organize it intergovernmental or supranational. I think you make some real points here to have the debate later on. Then I would like to give the floor to Carl Haglund. Carl Haglund is the chairman of the Swedish People's Party and the former Finnish Minister of Defense. He was also a member of this parliament between 2009 and 2012. Carl, or Kalle, as he is known in Finland, was elected chairman of his party in June 2012. I would like to give you the floor, please.
Thank you very much. Very good to be back in our former group room, or your current group room. And let me also say that it's a pleasure to speak at a seminar where the group has produced a very good and interesting report that is very, very topical, considering the European Council that will take place this week. Allow me also to say that since I 3 weeks ago had the opportunity to add former to my title, I'm more free to speak than ever, which will give me all the opportunities to give you a few good remarks. I'm going to start out by a few historical remarks, and then I'm going to go on with the paper. When we look at the situation in Europe, I think it's very important to note what has happened since the Cold War ended, at least the first Cold War, as we might have to call it in the future, where we, for a long time in the early 1990s and onward, believed that peace had come to Europe permanently. Former colleague Martin just quoted the European security strategy from 2003, which very much highlighted that we were prosperous and living in peace. Now we know that Europe is facing still very big economic trouble and foremost challenges on the security arena that are more challenging than we had ever foreseen 5 or 10 or 15 years ago. Because of this development, we also saw that in the 1990s and early 2000s, a lot of the European nations cut down their military spending, and focus was put on peacekeeping operations, mainly in the Balkans, Africa, but also Iraq and Afghanistan. Because of this development, also the focus of the national defense work in many countries was very much on these peacekeeping operations, and even NATO, that is still the main actor in European defense, was mainly focusing on what was happening in Afghanistan and before that in the Balkans. All of this drastically changed about 1.5 years ago. I can recall 3 years ago when I started my work as Minister of Defense, what we were discussing together with Janine and other colleagues at that time, and how that discussion totally changed overnight in the winter of 2014. And I don't think that any one of us could foresee that only months before it happened. And it's also very much changed the atmosphere in which things are discussed. Now we're in a new situation, a situation that hopefully is temporary. On the other hand, I guess it's honest to say that at this point in time, with more than a year of the crisis in Ukraine, it doesn't feel too temporary anymore, even though I'm convinced that all of us would hope it would be temporary, and we are starting to live in a situation that is resembling some type of new Cold War era, something that at least I hope will be very much temporary of its nature. This has also caused this mood change, and now we have a very different focus, and the shift back to focusing on the core tasks of military activities around Europe, both on a national level but also on a European level, on a NATO level. It's evident that today the military spending in Europe is not sufficient, and at least not sufficient in relation to the security threats that we, at least hypothetically speaking, are facing. On top of that, it's also evident that our military spending is far from coordinated. It's very much uncoordinated. What we have done over the past decades, we have established a military committee. Guy Verhofstadt explained some of the events back in the council in the 1990s when some were trying to get a more coordinated approach. Main achievements were mainly compromises. Some things were achieved. We have the so-called EU battle groups that exist. However, they have never been used, as most of you probably know. The military committee does work. However, it's been actually mainly focusing on the work with the EU crisis management operations, peacekeeping operations, where EU has been fairly successful actually in Africa and other places. And this is an arena where we have seen some positive development. Then at the same time, we have the activities within the NATO sphere. As you also most likely know, 22 out of 28 EU countries are members of NATO, and that does make a lot of things easier, but at the same time it poses a certain challenge because the 6 countries that are outside NATO, for instance, my own country, are in a somewhat different situation than everyone else. Meaning, for instance, that in principle, for instance, Finland is prepared to defend itself by itself if necessary, while 22 out of 28 countries are leaning back on Article 5, which is a very different situation from the one we are in. It's also good to state it clearly out that, at least in my view, it's clear that NATO is very much dependent on the United States. The US has been underscoring this themselves. The US part of the total military spending within the NATO is far too big in relation to the population and the economy. The European countries are not taking their responsibility economically. This is something that has been said for years. And this was also underscored quite regularly during the, also already before the crisis in Ukraine, but it's clear that as a result of the crisis, this has been a more discussed topic. And at the NATO summit last September, many NATO countries again signed up to increase in their military spending, and some have already taken steps in doing so. However, we know that a lot of countries have not, and might not even at this point in time have the economic means to do so. Because of this situation, it's clear that Europe needs to do more. When I used to be a member of this House, we used to say, when we talked about the economic crisis in Europe, that Europe was doing too little and too late. That was this slogan that, for instance, our friend Guy had to use in plenary quite often when we discussed the economic crisis. It's actually, unfortunately, still the case concerning the economic challenges, but it's also actually applies to the in a sense to the military part, where it's definitely too little and hopefully not too late. But we might want to bear this in mind when we look into the future, and hence I think it's clear that we need more coordination and more cooperation in the field of military defense spending. When we look at what we have today on top of the cooperation we have within the EU frame and NATO, we have these groups of countries that work in clusters. The Benelux cooperation was marketed here by Guy. I, on my side, could market the Nordic Defence Cooperation that I was chairing a few years ago, very successful model. All of these do bring a clear added value to the table, but at the same time it's also good to say that even though they bring about added value, they don't have a vital importance for the big picture challenge with the too little spending and too little coordination. From a Finnish point of view, I promised to give you a few remarks from an eastern flank, and also partially bearing in mind our geopolitical position, but also being a country outside NATO because of historical reasons. The current situation is far from pleasant because we have a very big and unpredictable neighbor, a neighbor that we have had a good historical relation to after the Second World War, before that a very traumatic one. But we have been, we learned over the years to swim with the crocodiles, and have been doing so quite well. Now the situation is new, and we have, I would say, even in a historical perspective, been more openly critical towards Russia than ever, and we have naturally been a part of all the sanctions and all the other measures that have been taken towards the regime in Kremlin because of everything that has happened over the 1.5 years that has passed. At the same time, being outside NATO, also Sweden actually being outside NATO, we are, as stated before, responsible for defending ourselves, and that means that we keep up a fairly big army, European comparison, and we also need to have a very capable army, meaning a lot of investments in military spending. At the same time, we are not a different country from everyone else. We have the same economic restraints as most European countries, and actually, honestly speaking, right now the Finnish economy is very bad, so it actually poses even bigger restraints than before. And also this calls for more cooperation. We have naturally cooperated for a long time, being NATO peace, Partnership for Peace partners, and being an active player in the EU defense cooperation, but this is still something different than what, for instance, the ALDE group is calling for today in its new policy paper. When discussing defense policy, at least in Finland, and I guess that goes for quite many other countries, one factor that is always brought on the table is how Russia might react to any changes in Europe. On a personal level, I believe that we should do our own decisions despite what the neighbor thinks, but at the same time it's wise to at least consider what kind of impact things might have. Last week our president visited Moscow and met President Putin. One of President Putin's messages was that Finland will be safe if you don't join NATO, more or less that was his message. Well, that's also what the Russians promised back in the days to the Ukrainians when they gave up their nuclear weapons, and we see how much that was worth. So it's clear that Russian promises cannot be taken seriously, because the Russians do one thing and say another thing. But at the same time, it's clear that the signal was very clear. The Russians don't want a NATO enlargement, and they don't want an EU enlargement. That's nothing new, though. That's been the tone all through the years, even though Russia was so weak in the 90s, so it enabled Finland and Sweden to join the EU without too bigger problems, and it also enabled NATO to enlarge quite fast. However, I'm convinced that these aspects will, at least at the eastern flank, be very much discussed when and if something bigger starts happening in Europe. Finally, a few words about what is happening this week. I had the pleasure, together with Janine and other colleagues, back in 2012, we were preparing for the European Council in 2013, December, when the heads of states for the first time discussed defense issues. And let me underscore that that was the first time, and that's 1.5 years ago, when they had this formally on their agenda. I don't know what it was formally called back in the days when Guy was trying to arrange some new office here in Brussels. But formally speaking, it's been seen as the first time 1.5 years ago. And now, in the meeting starting tomorrow, they're supposed to get back to the agenda, and over the 1.5 years that has passed, Martin, Janine, and I and others have been preparing for the meeting and also following up the decisions that were taken in December in 2003. Back then, the level of ambition that was achieved was, at least in my view, higher than I had anticipated. We were able to achieve a fairly high level, ambition level, considering that we're talking EU. In other words, it was agreed on several different areas where defense cooperation would evolve and develop, and so has also happened. We've seen very positive development over the past year, and I also believe that the crisis in Ukraine, in a sense, has speeded up the process. At the same time, we must note that the crisis in Ukraine has also meant that the NATO countries have more focused on their own work and developing NATO and NATO rapid response capabilities, and the EU development has been seen as secondary. I'm sure that Janine can second that. they're not in some sort of competition with each other, but it's evident that in the NATO sphere, the development of EU defense is maybe not number one on the agenda. And also in that respect, I believe that trying to sort of merge the two would be a fairly logical way of approaching things, and that's at least how I read this in ALDE position paper, where you're trying to also get rid of the fact that there is a certain competition going on, even though one has been quite keen on making sure that we are not doing parallel work, and that should still be the case in the future. Looking then finally where we're going to end up in the future, I believe that it's important that the EU keeps working on the issues that were agreed in December 2013, but it's also clear that it's too little and hopefully not too late if you want to create something that is of greater importance. It's also clear that as long as NATO exists, we're not going to build up anything that is competing with it. Hence, building up a European pillar of NATO would be a more logical step. It's also clear that all of these pooling and sharing, smart defense, etc., are the right way to work. But as I think Martin correctly said before, a clear challenge being that there's more talk than there's action. Far more talk than there's action. And we have positive examples. I'm sure that Janine can tell us about the Dutch-German cooperation. There is actually a lot of action also, and not only talk, and I can tell you a lot about the Finnish-Swedish defense cooperation that is far more action than it's talk. But on a general note, I would still say that the level of talk is far higher than the level of action. And that's not a very good situation, also considering how the security development has been over the past 1.5 years. And even though most of us hope that this is a temporary situation, and most of us would like to see some sort of going back to business as usual, meaning business 2 years ago, I don't believe that's possible anymore. We can't wind back the tape and just wipe out what has happened during the past 2 years, and it's most likely going to take years before trust is built back in Europe, and that's unfortunately going to push us in needing to make European defense cooperation more strong. At the same time, we are also facing new challenges with hybrid warfare, with cyber warfare, and also the rise of terrorism, etc., that mean that in the end also pushes us to work more collectively together in order to secure the everyday life of citizens in Europe. And in that respect, I believe that the ALDE policy paper is a very welcomed initiative in the debate. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Carl, for this clear vision. I think as a former Minister of Defense of Finland, you give a clear vision, and especially when you look at your neighbor, a big and unpredictable neighbor, I think this message was very clear. Then I would like to give the floor to somebody who is really known here in this house, and everybody told me already about her, even before I met her, Janine.
Oh my God.
So Janine is a member of, only good things, Janine, only good things. Janine is a member of the VVD. She has been the Minister of Defense in the Cabinet Rutte II since November 2012. She previously served as a member of the European Parliament for this group from July 2004 till June 2010, when she became a member of the Dutch House of Representatives, serving until she became the Dutch Minister of Defense. So please, Janine.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And like Carl, I'm very pleased to be back in the group. It feels like coming home, I have to admit. And as others, I'm actually very pleased that the future of European defense is back on our political agenda. And yes, I do subscribe to the sense of urgency needed to boost our defense cooperation. At the very same time, it's also important that we dare to reflect before proposing wild plans which in our current political environment are not likely to succeed. Now, before going into the details, I would like to take you back to the summer of 1950. Guy did it already a bit in his introductory words. When the French Defense Minister Hennis-Plasschaert Pleven proposed an elaborate plan for the constitution of a European Defence Community, the EDC, and Nathalie knows all about it. He presented a plan for the European Defence Community and the creation of a European army of 100,000 soldiers. Now, 100,000 soldiers, can you imagine? This European army, run by a European Minister of Defence and endowed with a common budget, would be placed under the supreme command of NATO. There would also be a federal structure to oversee and democratically control the planned European army. Now, does it sound familiar after reading the ALDE position paper? A treaty was signed on May 27 in the year 1952. This treaty, however, was never ratified, as mentioned already by Guy, as it was voted down in the French National Assembly. The EDC died an early death, among other things, due to fears that the EDC would simply imply an unacceptable surrender of national sovereignty. Now, more than 60 years later, these sovereignty concerns, unfortunately, still hold true today. Not only in France, but also in other EU member states. And it's not only a defense issue. As we can see across the channel, the UK has such serious concerns when it comes to the EU that they wish to renegotiate terms and conditions of their membership. And these are concerns, whether we like it or not, but these are concerns that we cannot and may not just simply ignore. Now, with the future of European defence again on the agenda, the ALDE Roadmap towards EU integrated military forces is, Guy, of course, a very good starting point for our discussions. Though I have to admit, when I read the paper, I had some mixed feelings. Obviously, my European heart skipped a beat. Integration of elements of our military forces to perform CSDP military operations beyond rapid reaction. Further development of European capabilities, an integrated European defence market and clear political leadership and decision making. It all sounds very sensible, and it is. So yes, the ALDE Roadmap presents great ideas. At the very same time, as I said at the beginning, it's also important to reflect. Not all of them represents realistic prospects for the near future. In fact, speaking about supranational structures or elements thereof, speaking about such structures now is, in my view, even counterproductive. Now, at the beginning of March, I had to respond to questions of national press and members of parliament about EU Commission President Juncker's suggestions for a European army. Even as a long-term perspective, his ideas caused quite some concerns amongst many Europeans. Now, I answered that the EU is not lacking in good intentions or policy proposals, but that these long-term views, and these long-term views, they are important, but these long-term views and future projects have a tendency to distract us from the more pressing issues of the here and now. So those who at this stage focus on a European Defence Union or integrated military forces are, in my view, skipping an important step. How can we have a European Defence Union if we're still lacking a common foreign policy? Now, don't get me wrong, European integration in the defence field is possible and it is desirable. What I'm saying is, first things first. Now, I also took note of the title of today's seminar, More Defence for Less Money. It's something I strongly disagree with, I have to admit. We can no longer afford to have more for less as our mantra. Our present geopolitical context and our ambition to be a strong security provider oblige us to seriously invest efforts and means in our defense, both at a national and a European level. Moreover, and as agreed during the NATO summit in Wales, we have to reverse the trend of declining defense budgets, make the most effective use of our funds, and further a more balanced sharing of costs and responsibilities, as underlined already by Carl. And yes, the economic upturn presents us with certain opportunities, yet again, speaking about the creation of a supranational army in these times does not help. We will have to further develop our union block by block with ambitious but realistic steps forward. The way I see it, we should, in our way forward, focus on 5 priorities. First, we should determine our strategy, setting our level of ambition, determine where we want to go, determine where we want to go before we set sail. We have all noticed, it was mentioned by the previous speakers, we have all noticed the dramatic change in the European geopolitical and security context. And for sure, the opening line in the European security strategy of the year 2003, for sure, the opening line that Europe has never been so prosperous, so secure, nor so free, that opening line is clearly outdated. Europe is surrounded by a ring of instability. We have an ever-increasing number of migrants knocking on our door due to tensions and conflicts further afield. Religious fundamentalism and extremism, coupled with climate change and scarce natural resources, result in a toxic mix which paints a dim perspective for future peace, prosperity and stability across the globe. And that is why I do welcome the High Representative Mrs. Mogherini's call for a common, comprehensive and consistent external strategy. For me, this really is a crucial first step. And clearly, our unity in facing the threats around us is crucial. Carl mentioned it already, and that is why we need to work together, not only within the EU, but also with our allies and partners such as NATO. And a new strategy will have to enable this. Now, the High Representative will have to speed up, though. If the EU is serious about becoming a convincing security provider in its immediate region and beyond, we have to act swiftly. We should not drag on the development of this strategy much longer. It would undermine the EU's credibility. But what is the purpose of a new strategy if we do not have sufficient means to execute it? Obviously, we can write down that Europe needs to step up its act, but that is not enough. This is why our second priority should be to tackle the critical military capability gaps we face within Europe. And that is why a new strategy should immediately be translated into actionable proposals to strengthen European defense. We should, in my opinion, come up with an EU defense white book, which describes the implications of a new strategic framework and defines the necessary capabilities and means we need. Thirdly, we can only come to the necessary means and capabilities if we dare to further enhance our defense cooperation in Europe. That is why we have to let go of the voluntary nature of defense cooperation. Now, each and every European nation shares responsibility for our collective security. Our security cannot depend on the efforts of just a few. And it is important to realize that enhanced defense cooperation does not mean giving up sovereignty. It is all about enhancing our collective ability to act. However, I am convinced that you cannot force countries to work together. It's only natural for countries to work together in smaller groups with like-minded partners, as it will yield faster results than initiatives involving all 28 member states. Initiatives such as the Nordic Defence Cooperation, or DEFCO, Benelux, Lancaster House, Visegrad, the Baltic Defence Cooperation, these initiatives work because of the limited setting. And let us not forget that regional or bilateral cooperation already go beyond what we thought was possible a few years ago. I only mention an agreement between the Benelux countries on the integration of their air security to respond to threats, or the Dutch cooperation with the Germans. Not only do we have a joint headquarters in Münster, but last year the Dutch Air Mobile Brigade was fully integrated into the German Division Schnelle Kräfte. This would have been unthinkable merely a decade ago. So in my view, we will have to be practical in this. What we need is a pragmatic, bottom-up approach enabled by top-down political guidance. Now, as is rightfully pointed out in the ALDE Roadmap, enhanced European defence cooperation also has implications for capability planning, acquisition, training and logistical support. So it requires transparency and alignment of national capability development plans and an annual or biannual moment to take stock. Ideally in a ministerial setting, so that amongst defense ministers we can create a system of peer pressure and praise those that lead by example so that others are encouraged to follow suit. Our fourth priority should be to work towards an open, transparent, and competitive defense market. We need a competitive market in which all sorts of companies, small or big, have cross-border access. We need a market that leads in terms of quality and value for money. This would serve our armed forces and it would serve our security needs. Moreover, we need to better connect and to apply knowledge in order to create innovations that boost our collective defense capabilities and concepts of operation. In order to keep our technological and competitive advantage, we need, indeed, a strong European defense technological and industrial base. And yes, investing in research and technology will be key. Innovation is indispensable in order to stay ahead of potential threats. And this is also why initiatives such as the preparatory action for CSDP-related research are so important. But let us be honest, in closing. A new strategic framework, a CSDP white book, the necessary defense cooperation in Europe, a well-functioning defense market, well-functioning industry. It will not help us much if we, the politicians, do not decide to deploy the military and their assets. So my fifth priority is all about political will and swifter political decision-making. Political will is crucial and will be even more so in the years to come, as I am convinced that Europe will be increasingly forced to respond to the challenges and opportunities the global environment presents. Europe will have to take responsibility for its own security. Now, clearly, in matters of security and defense, we will always need consensus. But we will need to obtain it quicker in order to be seen as a credible and reliable security actor by our citizens and by our partners. Now, my guess is that we all agree upon the urgent need for a more active, more coherent, more capable Europe in the field of security and defense. And if we all agree that defense matters, I say that we have to act accordingly and go beyond uttering nice political statements. As Karl Haglund rightly said, there is far more talk than action, and it's action we need. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Janine, for this positive, critical message you give with your 5 priorities, who are more or less the same as in the ALDE Roadmap, I think. I would like to give the floor now to our coordinator, Hans van Balen. He's a member also of the VVD. He's a member of the European Parliament for the Netherlands since July 2009, Hans. You have been a member of the House of Representatives from September 1999 until July 2009. You have been the president of the Liberal International between 2009 and 2014. And you now are the coordinator of our group in the Foreign Affairs, Security and Defense Committee. So please, I will give you the floor for the conclusions, Hans.
Hilde, first of all, I think we all think that you have done a remarkable work by making this paper. And I think the main conclusion is first, Fukuyama is no longer. Fukuyama, who said the end of history, so we would engage in global competition in economic spheres for the better, but war was something of the past. Unfortunately, that is not true. And it means that we have to make sure that when our interest or our territory is at stake, we are ready to use military force. The answer, to make it concrete, if the Baltic states would be attacked in some way, the only answer can be that yes, we will react in a military way. No doubt about that, because if we doubt about that, then with whom we ever deal with knows that we give in already. And if we want to do this, we should have indeed a credible army, armed forces. And I think that Janine called that, indeed, it's not doing more for less money, it's doing much more for more money. We should invest the 2%, which is required by NATO. And the fact that many countries say, but we have a very high quality armed forces, that's very nice, but we need to have also quantity. The fact that if you have so many headquarters which could be used and a planning cell which is not really used, I think, and that's my personal observation, that the plan of Guy Verhofstadt of Tervuren is worthwhile to dust it off and to see what we can do there. Because also, to my opinion, I want the United States to be involved in European security. But it cannot be if the United States at certain moments can't join us that we can't do anything. That is not a possibility. If we look indeed at the strategy paper of Solana, it should be renewed, a defense white paper, surely. We should invest in Frontex, surely. And what we can do, I think that both Martin and Carl spoke about things like cyber, air-to-air surveillance, etc. You could even say, let us see whether we can do this in a more supranational matter. But in the end, I think that we should work very closely with national parliaments when we want to put at use the European armed forces. Because if a country, indeed, for instance Germany, I don't see German colleagues, but concerning Libya, Germany said, we don't do it. We won't be involved. Well, then we have to have a mechanism either to convince them to be involved, but if they really don't want, I don't see that we as European Parliament or European Commission, we can say, we do it, we force the Germans or any other to do it. This is one of the most tricky things, but we should address it. Again, I think that we should work further on European defense within NATO, the European pillar, and in that put our money where our mouth is. The fact if we will be talking about more money for defense for the coming 10 years and we don't do it, it will not work. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Hans. I saw in the program that we first had to give the floor to the members who are here and that you then had to do a conclusion, but I suppose you can conclude after the interventions too, Hans. That's for you, no problem. So please, I would like to give the floor to the people. Ivo?
And then Jean.
Jean? Ivo?
Thank you very much. I have been, I got some etiquette in the past couple of months that I am a pacifist, and I realized that being a pacifist is almost a curse in some crisis. So I am not a sworn-in pacifist, but I am a former diplomat, about being former, yes, and a former journalist. And of course, I will never stop believing that the international problems has to be solved by politics, politicians, and diplomats. So I think we heard today some very encouraging and I would say well-founded ideas about how to strengthen European defense capabilities. I agree with this. I can agree with this, that we need a deeper integration in this field for the reason of spending more rational our money, and for the reason of having our defense capability in the function of deterrence. So I less like what some of the speakers said explicitly or implicitly, how happy we are now to have an enemy. No? Finally, we have an enemy. You know, we did have the system before, but we didn't have the enemy. Now we have even enemy, and how nice it is to have Russia as an enemy for use, for different use. So multi-purpose enemy. You know. So since I have to be short because I'm meeting now the ambassador of Dalai Lama, and we will be talking about peace, so I would just like to say that this linkage between the debate of enhanced cooperation in the field of defense should be deducted from a current picture of having enemy. I cannot accept that the notion that Russia is a long-term enemy of Europe. It is an European country. We have to find a way to re-establish a normal relation, of course, without caving in the imperial ideas of people like Putin and the breach and the violation of international law, etc., etc. But we have to be able also to confess and to realize that we contributed to the threats which we are now facing from the, as somebody said, from north and from south. I would say from every possible side, and the most of the threats are related to the wrong political decisions, to the lack of having a common European foreign and defense policy, and some very aventuristic things where we are cooperating, like the war in Iraq. I think that the case of the Germans were wise when they were warning what the war in Libya can bring. We know now what it brought. I think we were not cautious enough also by supporting adventurists and extremists in Syria, believing that we are supporting the democrats, etc., etc. So we have to have a balanced and wise politics first, and then, of course, also common goals and enhanced cooperation on the field of military and defense capabilities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ivo. I think nobody is happy to have an enemy. I think everybody here agrees. I think Karel want to react very short.
Just a brief point and a comment. First of all, my old colleague and friend Ivo is right when you were saying that we don't need an enemy, and I don't believe that actually anyone wants an enemy, nor has contributed to creating one. But it's evident that there's a lot of people and actors in Europe that are very disappointed with the fact that the development we saw in the 90s, where so many countries invested so much, both political capital and also actually money in integrating Russia as a part of Europe after the Cold War, then ended up with where we are right now. And it's probably wise to analyze why we are where we are right now, and we shouldn't put that aside. And as at least underscored in my own presentation, I do hope and believe that we're going to come out of this and can see this as some sort of temporary. But that doesn't mean that we can wipe out what just happened, and that's sort of the balance between the two, in my view. Concerning the development of European defense, and this was my point, when we started developing the EU defense cooperation back in 2012, actually before that, but actually the actual work started, that was before the crisis in Ukraine. For instance, the Council in December 2013 was before the crisis in Ukraine. So I think it's important to underscore that the development we're seeing within EU now is not a response to what's happening in Ukraine. It happened before that, but it's naturally also contributed to that it's seen as more topical than ever, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you. I will ask everybody to be short, because I understand that Janine has to leave us in a few minutes. So. But I would like to give the floor to Jean. Jean, please.
Merci. Merci. Et thank you. And congratulations. Thanks very much indeed for coming forward with these ideas and for commenting on them. As Carl pointed out, we talk a lot, but we don't do much. We heard about Frontex because we've got migratory flows that are getting out of control. But just boosting the funding for Frontex won't do it. Who's in charge? Frontex is involved in a series of different actions. But, you know, who's in charge politically? And you can try in vain to find who it is. For defense, for diplomacy, the same obtains. Now, defense and diplomacy cannot be kept separate from each other. Diplomacy that isn't backed up by the potential for military intervention is just polite gesticulation, particularly in a globalized world. So at some moment, we're going to have to start pooling sovereignty. It's too bad that the European defense community failed, but that was the time when Europe was divided. It might have been easier then, but anyway. Be that as it may, we've started sharing sovereignty through a currency. We have the Euro group as a result. Now, on the basis of Article 46, would it not be possible to have permanent structured cooperation that would allow certain states, as we did with the currency, so certain states who want to do it can work together? Let's not make the same mistakes as the Eurozone. We can't exactly say that Eurozone governance has been exemplary. Far from it. It's been a catastrophe to date. Who knows? Maybe the Beres report or the 5 presidents report will allow us to raise our game, but it's short on boldness and determination. But don't you think that some kind of enhanced standing cooperation, a bit like the Eurozone, we could lay the foundations for European defense community? Thanks very much. Perhaps I can take the other 2 speakers so we can take all the answers together.
So, he's the former Minister of Defense of Croatia. Please.
Thank you, Hilde. In order to be more clear and precise, I will speak in Croatian.
I believe that it is possible to have a better defense policy for less money, but this question is quite complicated, quite complex. I would like to emphasize 3 paradoxes of the European defense policy that we are currently facing. First, it is clear that we need a new European defense policy, as it has become clear that we will not get it, because we do not see that the European Council will have the strength to reach concrete decisions tomorrow. The best it can do is to give a clear mandate to the High Representative to draft and suggest the European security strategy. The second paradox related to this question is the following. If we form the European armed forces, it could not be used in the territorial defense of the EU and its member states. For the following reason. Securing European countries against an attack from outside cannot go through a European army, but through the member states' contribution to NATO. So the European army could not be used for the most important dimension of its defense, which is defense from an attack from outside. And the third paradox, which is also emphasized in our policy paper, which I support, is the question of the autonomous action in the defense of our interests outside the EU. We also speak about actions in line with the UN Charter, so in line with the UN Security Council decisions. Therefore, we can act autonomously, independently, unless we're faced with a veto by China, Russia, or any other member of the Security Council. So the question is, how can we act independently if we act in line with the political decisions of or political will of Russia or China? So these are some of the paradoxes of the European defense policy, and until we find a suitable answer to these questions, the European defense policy, as has been emphasized today, will remain just a story. So there is much more in terms of words than in actions. Data on the defense policy, independently of the NATO dimension, are very sad. Everything that has been happening in the past 10 years, but also in the last few years when it has become clear that Europe is facing new challenges, actually are not in favor of a common defense policy. The spending of the member states for defense has dropped, so it has not been maintained at the same level. They dropped, and all the goals established by the European Defense Agency back in 2007 regarding the joint cooperation in research and defense and joint procurement, which means having common standardization for army equipment and weapons. None of these goals were met. Not only that, but in the past few years, the share of joint research in the area of defense and the joint procurement actions has dropped. So not only have we not met these ambitious goals, but in fact, the situation is much worse than it was. Personally, I believe that Europe cannot have a common defense policy unless it defines relations within NATO. These relations cannot be relations of full dependence on the US, nor can we afford to be in opposition to the US. In the past 10 years, China has tripled its GDP and has tripled its defense spending. China has 60% of US GDP, and 10 years ago the world was unipolar, but it is no longer the case, and therefore the EU should take full responsibility for its own territorial defense, which is not the case right now, and should also provide a security guarantee at least for the immediate neighborhood. If this is not clearly set out in the European security strategy, our defense policy will unfortunately remain just a story without having full effects.
I have the last speaker, I think, and that's Petras.
Thank you, Hilde. Well, firstly, I want to react to some comments made by colleague Ivo. I don't believe we are happy we discovered Russia is a threat. So what a pleasure to discover such a threat nearby and indeed ill-minded country. No, we discovered a country which pretended to be a partner, at the same time playing very under-carpet games and creating insecurity instead of security by partnership. I see no pleasure, and I take this statement as a bit irresponsible. I mean, we can't talk these things to our voters. I mean, they will not understand us in a right way. I want to react to some points made by our Dutch colleague, who unfortunately left. Well, indeed, on European scale, I mean, the regional or bilateral or trilateral cooperation and multilateral cooperation looks a bit more practical and achievable. And there are indeed good examples to follow and to name, not just Benelux, Dutch, German, Belgian, Dutch. In the Baltic region, we have Nordic-Baltic cooperation, Baltic cooperation, Lithuanian, Polish joint battalion, and so on. And I wonder, to what extent we should probably review Eurocorps or other structures, since now we cooperate mainly on regional level? How about crossing borders? I mean, how about meeting partners, for example, my country and Spain, Belgium and Poland, and so on and so forth? So how should we review existing structures and to make them more attractive for countries probably joining? Because I see a better future if we indeed establish a good regional or cross-regional cooperation. Then for those bigger groups will be more easy to join in something more bigger rather than one by one. I see a good tendency, so probably we have to enforce this tendency, to enhance this tendency, give more money and more political impetus to it in order to create a good tendency which might bring indeed a desired European military cooperation and hopefully joint European defense forces or army, whatever we call it, into something more practical.
Thank you very much, Petras. Indeed, the two ministers left already because there was a meeting of the NATO here in Brussels. So they're talking with our American friends over there. I would like to give the floor to Karel for a brief reaction, and then Hans will conclude.
Yes, thank you very much. Just a few points. Partially in relation to what was said, and very much in relation to where we are right now, where if we pose a hypothetical situation that unfortunately it doesn't seem so feasible, but still not impossible. Let's say that one European country is under military attack. Hans underscored that a reaction would be necessary. But let's, for instance, say that it wouldn't be one of the NATO countries. Say it's Cyprus or Malta or someone else. What will the EU do? We have the EU solidarity clause. It's not a Article 5 type of clause, but it still does oblige us to do something. But is it more of civilian nature? Would it be in theory possible for the EU to just stand there and do nothing? My answer is definitely no. It's not possible for the EU to do nothing. But even though, fortunately, it doesn't seem like something that could happen any day, it's still not impossible, and we don't really have an answer, and it hasn't been discussed enough. And also in the light of that, I do believe that the initiative by ALDE and this roadmap is a very good initiative in the debate, and there are certain things that aren't discussed with the right names, at least not in the Council, with at least my 3-year experience of discussing these things. There are issues that aren't discussed in the appropriate way. Then I believe it's important to remember that also when we talked about territorial defense, deterrence. The fact that a lot of defense cooperation in Europe today and also elsewhere is very much built on deterrence, and the fact that you show that you are capable of working together and that you also are dedicated in working together and even actually obliged in working together does pose a fairly high threshold of doing anything, and that's actually the best way of doing defense policy, where you're able to this way build up defense structures that secure our security without having to use weapons. And here again, everything we can do to strengthen our cooperation will be of great importance. Then there was a parallel to the Pervans Perez report and the report by the 5 chair people. That is a very topical report. My own history, when I worked in this house, I worked with the so-called 6-pack and the 2-pack, and back in the days we did have to stretch the treaties quite a lot in order to be able to save Greece, save Portugal, and after that do all the legislation that was needed. And at least my personal view is that we did a very positive we took a positive approach, and one tried to use the treaty as far as it was possible in order to do what was necessary in a difficult situation. And I'm convinced that if a security threat would face the Union or one of its member states, we would have to do the same. And in order not to be there and not to have the discussion we had back then with what the treaty enables and what doesn't, it would be necessary to, in the near future, to have a discussion on these possible security threats, and the security strategy does pose a possibility to initiate this discussion. Personally, I'm not extremely optimistic, but also because of that, I'm glad that the ALDE group, once again, is a group that comes with initiatives that starts a necessary discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Carl. And then Hans, it's up to you to conclude.
If you saw the questions and the remarks put by the colleagues, I think that we should be realists in the fact that also a NATO member of EU should be defended. I mean, I'm sitting next to a former Minister of Defense of Finland, and if Finland would be under threat, I think we just can't be standing by and saying, sorry, this is a Finnish problem. So as long as we don't decide that if the Union or individual countries are a threat, and that we in this case can decide to use military force, we can just go home. If I see the input to the discussion, my conclusion would be that in the end everybody wants to defend our values and our interests and our members. Secondly, how we do it specifically and what timing, that's another matter. I would say the Verhofstadt plan of Ter Vuren seems to me a very credible plan to start with, and of course putting money into defense. Thank you.
We had a very interesting meeting here. I would like to thank, of course, our guests for coming, and all the participants and all the journalists who have joined us. Thank you very much and have a good meal.